Welcome to this seminar organized by the Philip K. Wong Center of Chinese Law of our Faculty of Law, with the co-organizer, which is the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the World, also of Hong Kong U. This is a dual mode seminar, so welcome to everyone who is online, as well as all of you here. I think more people are online than those physically in this room. So this is a public lecture to be delivered by Professor Anthony Carty. Actually, he is our former colleague at the Faculty of Law. He used to be the Sir Y. Gay Pao Chair of Public Law at the Faculty of Law. Currently, he is a visiting senior scholar at Nanjing University. So Professor Carty traveled all the way from Nanjing to Hong Kong a few years ago, a few months ago, sorry, a few days ago. And we are very honored and privileged that he is able to come to give this lecture this evening. I think many of you here may have heard about Professor Carty's works on international law. He has many world famous publications, including a book called The Decay of International Law, which was published in 2019 in the second edition, and also Philosophy of International Law, second edition, 2017. These books, as I understand, have been translated into various languages. So they are receiving international attention. One of his most recent works is on the history and sovereignty of the South China Sea Islands, which is a very topical issue which people in Hong Kong are interested in. Professor Carty is also editor-in-chief of the online resource called the Oxford Bibliography of International Law, Oxford Bibliography Online in International Law. In recent years, Professor Carty has visited China many times, and one of his current research interests is to look at the role of China in the international legal order. So today's lecture is entitled China in the World, New Visions of World Order or More of the Same. So it's my honor to ask Professor Carty to begin his lecture.
So this is working. So I would like to thank my friend Albert Chen for the invitation to come here. And it means quite a lot to me to try to come back to the university where I began my studies about the history of international law in China. And I finished my time here by editing a book called Morality and Responsibility of Rulers, which is a study of history of international law during the century of humiliation from 1842 right until the fall of the Qing dynasty. And subsequent to that, I've continued to do work on the Shandong, May the 4th crisis, and on Manchuria, and so on, and up until the Second World War. So I am very interested in this question of China's role in the future. And I have prepared a lecture which is too long, it's 39 pages, but I will maybe summarize the first part and maybe go into more detail in the second part. The first part is called An Outline of the History of Western International Law, its scope and limits in the light of immediate threats of global conflict. In that, I intend to deal also concretely with international law issues concerning China in the Western Pacific or the East and South China Sea. The second part of my talk is more original and more audacious, maybe intellectually, and it's entitled The President Xi Jinping Thought and the Reintegration of the Moral Person in Relation, in inverted commas, into the Thinking of International Law, the dialogue of civilizations, from relations of states to include also peoples to peoples, and the idea of the common destiny of mankind. And that is a bit more original than what I will be saying to begin with. Now, by way of introduction, I I think this whole subject is very sensitive and very complicated. So, I mean, if I start summarizing, it's going to become a bit crude, but there's no alternative. It would take about 3 hours to read through this lecture. China has celebrated the 80th anniversary of the United Nations by affirming its adherence to the principles of international law as the common language of world order. There is no specific mention of the frequent violations of international law, particularly as they affect China. China has a difficult path to tread. If it says international legal order is incomplete or out of date, China will probably find itself branded as a revisionist power bent on overturning the international order. Instead, China calls for a democratic world order based upon the sovereign equality of states, which is very vague, and which hardly anybody would disagree as long as they don't know exactly what it means. Instead, China calls for this based on the sovereign equality of states. At the same time, China has published several white papers since 2023, the Global Security, Development, and Civilization Initiatives, and they're encompassed further in a global community of shared future. This lecture will endeavor to show that how far limitations of these initiatives address the incompleteness of international law, and do provide clear benchmarks for addressing some of the most glaring injustices to China, which the existing international legal order has not been willing to resolve. It will do so by making some reference to the white papers, but it will also draw on some very recent and unpublished work by sympathetic foreign commentators who have been able to delve more deeply into the theoretical philosophical background to the development of Xi Jinping thought. To undertake this, it is necessary to give, however extensively, an account of some of the incompleteness of international law as it affects China, before going on to describe Chinese thinking, which is apparently outside the explicit boundaries of international law concepts. The endeavors of international lawyers, Chinese and foreigners, to integrate these new intellectual developments into the structure of international law are only at a beginning stage. Now, part one, the outline of the history of international law, its scope and limits in the light of the immediate threats of global conflict. Now, there's a standard view of international law, and here I will go into summarizing, that international law is a complete legal order which regulates the coming into existence of states. The elements of statehood are taken from the Montevideo Convention, a Latin American convention, which is not universally agreed standard and not a binding legal document. That a state is a government with a defined territory, with a population acquiescing in fact in its government, which is itself ready to observe international law. The fact of self-determination of a people can be evidence of acquiescence in this government, but it doesn't generate a right to separate itself from the state and to set up a new state in the absence of the agreement of existing states. Now, it's not here the aim to defeat this pose one principle against another, but to argue that historically and up to the present, the existence of states is a matter of fact and not law, and it happens outside any actual legal order. Historically, the legal order simply works with and takes as given the existence of states, and the elements theory is merely an empirical rule of thumb to assist in a pragmatic judgment as to who is to count as being in and out. The difficulty, of course, is that in the present practice, states will consider themselves legally entitled to treat some entities which satisfy these elements as still not states, while other states will consider as states entities which are clearly do not satisfy these elements. We'll think in the first category, a very controversial but possible example is Taiwan, and the second example would be the state of Palestine, which doesn't exist physically. The deconstructive argument here is that both arguments misunderstand the fact that there is actually no international law regulation of this question at all. Recognition of this can serve a constructive purpose as it deprives each side of the power to accuse each side of arguments to accuse of the power to accuse the other of violating international law and opens the way possibly to some middle ground. Now, the reasons for this statement of mine, I think, go back to the history of international law, a history that here I will summarize that I cover in my Decay of International Law. International law in diplomatic archives, which I've been able to look at through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, not to mention the 20th century, limited the scope of international law to not consisting of a system of international law, but merely a regulation of certain discrete areas like diplomatic law, aspects of the laws of war, and aspects of the law of sea. But it was not a complete system. And the diplomatic practice, which of course is primarily, I'm thinking of Europe, would provide that there are at least three elements of the international order. There is international law, which is not the most important. There's the European public law, and there is the balance of power. That's to say, there's an unwritten rule that somehow or other there must be a balance between countries and no one country must be able to dominate the international system. Now, this has an important, so international law is defined by classical international lawyers. The subject of international law is defined by classical international lawyers like Ancelotti, a very famous international lawyer of the early 20th century. An international legal person is an entity to which the rules of international law apply. But there was no international law of a sovereign's territory delimiting the domain of sovereignty apart from treaties of exchange concluded between great powers. And if sovereigns disagreed on the interpretation of these treaties, they could resort to war. Now, this has an important consequence for the language of the UN Charter, which China keeps insisting it supports unqualifiedly. The language of the UN Charter does not guarantee the right of states to exist within the territory of their boundaries. It merely prohibits, virtually absolutely, states settling their differences about the extent of their territorial obligations using force. The 1945 Charter is completely agnostic about the legitimacy of territorial claims, but simply excludes absolutely the use of force as a means of settling disagreements. So the really important point is that international law is thoroughly incomplete on the whole question of what territory belongs to what country. It's quite agnostic about that. And that's quite an absurd limitation on a legal order, that it can't really say what property belongs to whom. But that is the position. It merely says that disagreements about who owns property should not be solved through the use of force. And the great jurist Hans Kelsen, commenting on the UN Charter, thought that it was doomed to fail because on the one hand, it prohibited self-help, it prohibited the classical way of resolving disagreements, which was to fight it out, but without providing any compulsory judicial or other settlement procedure to solve difficulties. So I want to stress this incompleteness and unsatisfactory character of international law, which you don't have stated openly by any major power. We'll come to the United States later and have some provocative remarks to make about it, but it's certainly not stated by China that international law is inadequate or incomplete. But to my mind, it is a fundamentally unsatisfactory instrument for the government of international society. And to be particularly stressful, I stress here that Hans Kelsen is, for those of you who know anything about legal theory, is a very dominant and important figure who had very much the view that the international legal order is a complete system, as did Herst Lauterpacht, the dominant figure in Britain. But by that, they simply meant that they followed the liberal principle that if a particular conduct by a state was not prohibited, it was therefore legally permitted. And this way you can have a complete system of law. If there is no rule, then you can do what you like. That's what really the argument that there is a complete system means. But that's obviously unsatisfactory. And Hans Morgenthau was a roguish student of Kelsen, who studied with Kelsen in the late 1930s in the Geneva Institute of International Law. And he rebelled. He had done a bachelor's degree in law. He was a qualified German lawyer. He had done a master's degree in Frankfurt, written in the German language. And then he wrote in Geneva in French a dissertation called The Reality of Norms in International Society, and went on in 1946 to write a devastating book on liberalism and scientific man, which basically provided an intellectual foundation for the setting up of the realist discipline of international relations in the United States and discrediting the very foundation for international law. And he took as his main example the absence of any evidence that the creation of states in international law was regulated by any legal order. Now, this is terribly important for China because the issue of Taiwan is an issue to do with creation of states and definition of territory and boundaries. Now, the crippling effect of this positivist argument is precisely then that the international community has no way of regulating arguments about the foundation of territory in international law. And that is a fundamental problem that attaches to Palestine. It attaches to the Ukraine. And it really distorts the single most important gap that we have in international law, which is the maybe not the cause, but the context of the huge increase in international tensions that we have at the present time. Now, I argue, and I won't go a great deal into this, but it's another theme of the decay of international law, that the idea that there is a complete system of international law is actually a construction of academic doctrine. When I was in Cambridge as a student of Clive Parry, I wanted to study the history of international law and go back to the great Grotius. I fancied always the idea that the international lawyer should be an intellectual and an academic and a free-ranging thinker dealing with contemporary problems, which is obvious that Grotius tried to do with some success. But he said, no, you should study Vattel, the Law of Nations of 1758. This is the man who constructed the conceptual framework of international law that is in every modern textbook. Oppenheim, Lauterpacht, Brownlee, and the Chinese editions of international law are merely reproductions of the Western positions. Brownlee is more or less translated by Bingbing Jia in Tsinghua to come out as very much the same thing. Now, this is quite important, again, because international lawyers will argue that the system is complete, but my argument, where there is a need for a complete rethink of the subject, is that the construction of Vattel is not fictional, but it's an intellectual construct. It's an intellectual model of what international society should be like. Now, another point that I want to make there, which is very, very important when we come to thinking of the Xi Jinping thinking on international law, is that Vattel is and I don't mean to start another row here, but Vattel is a Calvinist Protestant. He was from Neuchâtel within the frame of the Presbyterian tradition of Calvin and John Knox in Scotland. And he firmly believed in individual conscience and in the absolute freedom of individual conscience. And he firmly believed that natural law was all very well, but human beings didn't agree about what its content was. And the states were in a state of nature. There is no international order. They resemble individual human beings, but in an environment where there isn't a global state, there isn't a state legal order, and ultimately everything comes down to these countries' consciousness, individual consciousness about what is right and what is wrong. And if they disagree, then they have no alternative but to fight it out. And the the position that he presents is extremely clear. His book is a wonderful read. It's a read of a pure intellectual who has a vision of conscience. He doesn't think it's a terrible tragedy because he believes that the natural condition for human beings is to lead their own lives and mind their own business and not bother with other people. And on that basis, that if they do that, there's not going to be much conflict. So it's a liberal model. And when you talk about international law being a product of Western civilization, this is basically the model of civilization that we are talking about. And it's beautifully and lucidly presented and a pleasure to read, and I recommend it to you to read. And there's a French author called Emmanuel Jouanet who has done a major study on this, Vattel and the Emergence of Classical International Law, now translated into English. And she describes the nature of international society as one that wishes to celebrate the autonomy of countries. And Western culture, more and more increasingly, with the development of modernism and postmodernism, is radically committed to celebrating personal autonomy. The difficulty that one is in face with then is that how do we resolve differences, and whether or not there is a possibility of resolving differences through any kind of concept of international order. And so opposing Vattel and Jouanet, there is the great English writer of the post-First World War, Brierley, who wrote a wonderful little book called The Law of Nations. And Brierley says that with the doctrine of absolutely subjective consciousness of Vattel, he has cut international law away from any sound foundation or principle of obligation, and that there is absolutely no moral basis on which you can construct an international law that could overcome the individualism of states. Now, that brings me along to get a bit more concrete on the situations facing China. In the history and sovereignty of the South China Sea Islands, I explained the consequence of this illusion of legal order created by textbooks copying Vattel, because the textbooks present Vattel sovereign equality, independence of country, freedom from compulsory adjudication, a duty not to use force in their relations with one another, but it doesn't spell out fully the significance of a doctrine of absolute subjectivism. Unilateralism, there's a great deal of talk about unilateralism, but unilateralism is built into the very nature of international law. And that is a philosophical problem, which I think that thought of Xi Jinping in a way tries to get around. Now, I explain the consequences of this illusion of legal order created by textbooks copying Vattel in my little book, The History and Sovereignty of the South China Sea Islands. I base my argument on primary research in the Eisenhower Archives in Princeton and in State Department archives in the U.S. National Archive in Maryland. The United States decided to exclude the People's Republic of China from the Peace Conference of San Francisco and to conclude a peace treaty with Japan at the same time as it concluded a stationing of U.S. forces agreement with Japan. At the request of John Foster Dulles and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was resolved that the objective was explicitly to exclude the People's Republic of China from Taiwan, pescadores, paracels, and spratlys. This is in the records of the FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States. It's not secret. As a matter of the national security interests of the United States, it was in the national security interest of the United States, in the judgment of the United States, to contain China. And that this expression, contain China, is actually in the records. In the words of the State Department record, the San Francisco Treaty was a function of what the United States considered to be its security interest. So built into the order in East Asia is this notion that it is normal for great powers to have an absolutely subjective the definition of what suits them. And the conclusion of the treaty was at the same time, and this may surprise people, was regarded as a violation of international law by the State Department legal advisor, Adrian Fisher, because its only object was to restore Japanese sovereignty so that Japan could concede military bases to the United States. And because two major wartime allies, China and the Soviet Union, were not parties to the treaty. So the San Francisco Order is illegal in the view of the American State Department legal advisor. It's also in the view of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was illegal to have a treaty, a peace treaty, which excluded Russia and China. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff thought that was a good reason for not having a treaty rather than having a treaty with Russia and China. So they were equally unilateralist. Now, this is really quite important because I'm building up to the idea that the whole territorial order of East Asia is a void, all the way from the Kuril Islands down to the Spratlys and to Indonesia. There is no legal framework there. And John Mearsheimer has insisted that this is what really makes the situation in East Asia much more dangerous than in Europe during the Cold War, because there is no legal framework, and you simply have one dominant power subjectively considering that what it considers to be its security interest. And an aggressive power in its eyes is any power that it thinks subjectively is threatening its supremacy. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I'm not making this up. It's in the record. It's in numerous national security documents. And I'll come to again later in the second part of my paper to a repetition, verbatim repetition of these arguments in Donald Trump's latest national security report that's just been published a few weeks ago. So we have no law of territory, and that means that there is no international law way of regulating the outcome of the Second World War. I mean, it would be possible for the United States as the power, the dominant power that defeated Japan, to simply declare that Taiwan was part of the United States, the Philippines were part of the United States anyway, and the various other territories, Okinawa, that it conquered from the Japanese. I mean, a right of conquest is one of the advantages of victory. Now, there is a second major defect of international law, which I think on a practical term is even more important, and that has to do with the nature of treaties. According to the classical view of the role of treaties in international relations is quite different from the view that will be taught in the textbooks at the moment. The view of the textbooks is that there is an international convention on the law of treaties, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties of 1969, which reads as Clive Parry, who influenced and supported me very much in these views, is a kind of Cheshire and 5 foot gone mad into international relations, treating treaties as legal documents, much the same as a contract for the purchase of land or even for purchase of mobile goods. Now, I went through for my thesis and then described in The Decay of International Law, the view, surprising view, it surprised me, it was a conclusion of my research, that the Chichely Professor of International Law in Oxford in 1868, Montague Bernard, said, treaties are not legal instruments, they are moral commitments, and international society has not worked out a clear standards for when circumstances have changed, treaties have become disadvantageous, and where it would be unreasonable to insist upon a country carrying out an obligation. And the same view is expressed in Cambridge just before the First World War, the 20 or 30 years before the First World War. You have Westlake arguing that there are that treaties made among great powers are matters for state interest to consider whether it is wise in the circumstances for them to continue. Now, this all sounds anarchic, but there is a principle which I think could be followed, which is that Van Bankershoek, who was a leading Dutch international lawyer of the early 18th century, he pointed out that honor is like the breath of life, and when it is gone, it never returns. He's talking about the abandonment of a treaty obligation, or the disregard by a country of a treaty obligation. He has in mind Elizabeth I had made an alliance with Holland and then decided that protecting Holland in an alliance was too dangerous. So he puts it in these terms. Between the several independent nations, there is no legal compulsion, since the laws do not apply to international affairs, and the whole source of compulsion lies in the law. But the dictates of good faith and expediency require that international agreements should be observed, and to these must be attributed as much force as the strongest pledge. To argue that a prince may cease to observe a treaty once it is no longer advantageous to the state is the same as repudiating the purchase of goods when the price goes down. He does confine limits to treaty obligation to clear cases of material necessity, but not the general struggle of power among princes. Far from respecting any so-called state practice, he rates the personal integrity of princes as very low. However, he does accept that a prince's power may evaporate and that it cannot be made to reassert a power to assist another country when he simply doesn't have it. But this view is basically very, very important when one comes to consider the situation, which is heating up at the moment, the Taiwan question, where you have the Cairo Declaration that all the territories conquered from China by Japan will be handed back to China. The Pescadores, the South China Sea Islands, and Taiwan, and the legal arguments that occur around that. But I want to say before I come to that, I have a lot to say about that. Before I come to that, I want to point out that there has been a study recently by Meg Donaldson, an Australian international lawyer who's present a lecturer or senior lecturer in University College London. She published a study in 2017, which sums up my own view as well, that the majority of treaties that are concluded at the moment are not intended to be legally binding. That's to say, treaties by virtually every country in the world. Treaties are generally regarded as confidential arrangements among countries, and they are not publicly announced, their content, especially any treaties to do with national security and any treaties to do with military cooperation. These are really kept under secret, kept in secret. But she then points out, how can one have an international order based on treaties when states do not register them with the United Nations and are not interested to have these treaties argued out before an international court? So she says that we are basically where we were in the 19th century. And she regards this as a disaster because it means the international order then has no way to regulate it. But I want to argue something quite different, that basically treaties should be understood as moral commitments, and in the context of the moral commitment, one then can come to a conclusion as to whether or not they should be observed. Now, the row over, for instance, to take the Cairo Declaration, the Taiwanese foreign minister says that Cairo Declaration is clearly not legally binding because it provides that the territories in question should be handed over back to China, with the implication that they have not as yet been handed over. And then a peace treaty at which they should have been handed over did not take place. And so they have not been handed over to China, and therefore they don't belong to China. Well, my argument is that this is basically in bad faith because it was a decision of the United States to exclude China from the peace conference. for its own political reasons that led to the situation that the handover never took place in the form of a peace treaty. And there I want to bring to your attention, because I try to base my views about international law on archival practice and not on reading and parsing of judicial decisions of the International Court of Justice. Fitzmaurice did take the view, Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice, about whom I've written quite a lot, published a book about his legal practice in the British Foreign Ministry before the Second World War. And then I have an unpublished book of about 400 pages of his legal practice after the Second World War. And in 1954, the issue of Taiwan came onto his desk because of the Taiwan-United States Defense Agreement. And he said that in his view, the Chinese government is the de jure government of China. And while Formosa was undoubtedly Chinese until the cession of Formosa to Japan in 1895, and while it was agreed at the Cairo conference that all territory seized by Japan from China would be returned to China, and I'm quoting now what he says in the archive, the territory was not returned to China through a peace treaty, and China has not been able to acquire effective occupation. The Chinese government must regard the argument about lack of effective occupation and lack of transfer of title by cession in a peace treaty as a technicality. But it was not open to Britain to support a Chinese forceful seizure of Taiwan. He took the view that any forceful upsetting of the status quo would be treated as aggression, whether it was by Taiwan or whether it was by the United States. However, he came to an important conclusion about the situation, which I think is worth quoting at length. Fitzmaurice recognized that, and here I am quoting, there appears to be no doubt that the basic Chinese character of Formosa, the relevant clause of the San Francisco Treaty merely provided for a renunciation of Japanese sovereignty. In the normal course of events, there would have been a simultaneous cession to China. This was not possible because of the anarchic refusal of the United States to recognize the People's Republic, PRC government of China. This was a decision, and I'm quoting from the records here, based on the assumption that recognition is a pure matter of policy and involves no question of law whatever. However, an official circulator of the Foreign Office, published after consultation with Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice and with Sir Eric Beckett, called The Recognition of State and Government, describes the American approach as follows. It makes nonsense of a great part of international law, and if generally followed, may render almost impossible the working of any international organization. When a greater part of international law is directed to defining the rights of states, it is not a very sound foundation if state A can avoid a greater part of its obligation to state B by deciding as a matter of pure policy not to recognize the other state and not to recognize what is obviously its government. And this is in the context that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had, including then John Foster Dulles, had reported to Truman and Atchison, and this is again in the records, it should be made certain that there can be no basis, either stated or applied, written into the treaty, which might provide for the possible claims of Communist China to sovereignty over Formosa, the Pescadores, Paracels, or Spratleys. The legal memorandum of the State Department commented in addition that given the absence of the Soviet Union in China, there was little to be gained by attempting to deal with territorial questions, and it's better to regard matters to do with the peace treaty as a matter of national security. So in conclusion, I'm trying to argue that really, if one is to decide the issue of whether the Potsdam and the Cairo Declaration are to be honored, I think it is a moral question, which really is a function of determining whether the United States was entitled to simply declare that China did not exist as a state in 1949, 1950, and that for American views of security interests, the territories that had been conquered by Japan should not be handed over. It seems to me as a moral issue it is possible to argue that the treatment of this issue is indefensible. But from a legal point of view, I believe that the law is an illusion here. There isn't an international legal order defining the force of treaties and determining how disputes about treaties can be resolved. The whole international legal order suffers from defects about at the same degree as this one, and that is why there is a need for rethinking. And I realize I'm 3/4 of the way through my time, and I've just about summarized the first part of my talk. Now, when I come to the second part, President Xi Jinping thought and the reintegration of the moral person in relation into the thinking of international law, dialogue of civilizations, and so on. I want to, oh, there's a page, is there a page missing here? No, it isn't, it's not missing. As explained in the first part, it is not well appreciated basic feature of international law that the law does not create states and does not therefore assure them of a right to exist. International law merely addresses rules to states which already exist. Now, this is a context in which one has to face the fact that there has been Western subversion of many global South countries, such as Guatemala, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Brazil, Syria, Chile, and many others. At present, the Sudan, Nigeria, and especially Venezuela are under severe attack. And this is the context in which the contribution to China to modernization and the development of the notoriously strong Chinese state, supposedly authoritarian, with its implications for the conceptualization of human rights is decisive. From the start of its existence, the Chinese Communist Party has had the happiness, I'm aware that this is pretty heavy, controversial stuff, the well-being of the Chinese nation as its goal and responsibility. And now China, especially under the direction of Xi Jinping, calls for a commitment of its people to the family and to the nation. Now, his thought draws a very sharp distinction from neoliberal economics. Instead, it realizes that a unity between economic development and the political, social, and ecological, and especially cultural aspects of people's being is crucial. He draws values from the classical Chinese heritage, the people-oriented idea, the harmony, virtue, and especially Confucian sense of unity between family and nation. And these elements are all integrated systematically to foster the collective purpose, which is the essential formation and development of the Chinese nation. Now, this Communist Party as the organizational form of the nation, the embodiment of it, responsible for its historical rejuvenation, can succeed in unifying the forces into a political order and cultural progress. So unlike the neoliberal West, where private capital is beyond the power of the state and indeed controls its financials, its chief officials, and its media communication, the Chinese state, inspired by this ideal, can discipline the inherent nihilism of the unrestrained desire for individual wealth. There is a private sector of the economy and there are capitalists, but there is no capitalist class. The power of direction is with the state, which integrated with the people can resist foreign interference and economic bullying. The famous or infamous cyber firewall completes the virtual impenetrability of the Chinese state, and China is careful not explicitly to export this model. However, its strength enables it to develop well-known initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and above all, the rapidly expanding BRICS. China encourages the solidarity of the global South with a rapidly expanding South-South trade, alternating sources of finance, and above all, people-to-people relationships. Something similar to this Chinese holistic, non-discriminatory empowering of the entire nation is an essential prior condition of solidarity among peoples. So what I'm arguing here, well, I'm not arguing this, I'm picking this up from interpretations of Xi Jinping thought from various intellectuals in Italy, in Brazil, in Mexico, Argentina, and Nigeria, and other countries, that this is actually an effective overcoming of the absence of any theory about how one can construct and sustain a state as a subject of international law. further feature of this thought is the will to rejuvenate the nation through bridging technological modernization with classical ethical attitudes, ethical tradition. This is an idea which involves a huge break with Vattel, who is a figure of modernity. Ontologically, the classical ethical tradition restores the place of the human being in a moral universe and denies that the human being is totally autonomous and not legally, not morally obliged to fit in to an ontological ethical order. Now, this is explicitly part of the Xi Jinping thought. This idea goes further to call for a dialogue of civilizations. That's to say, a dialogue between the Chinese Confucian civilization and this very modern, postmodern Western civilization. It's a call which has completely fallen on deaf ears. I mean, Xi Jinping and China are simply regarded as aggressive and dangerous and all the rest of it. A call to commitment to family and nation, which is common to both China and Russia, will tend to be regarded in Europe and even America as neo-fascist in the face of the radical modernist individualism, which now finds a central feature in the ethos of self-certification of identity. The family as such is impugned by feminism and popular Freudianism as oppressive. So basically, this whole way of thinking, it pops outside international law and provides that international order has to be grounded in a concept of the person, of the family, and of the community, which places the individual person in the classical sense, as does European Christian and Greek natural law, in an ontological whole. And it's that ontological whole which provides the stability for international order and not a radical doctrine of individual consciousness. While these views are widely shared and propagated publicly in China and Russia, these two countries are aggressively portrayed as aggressively nationalist and as maintaining conservative and hence inhibiting social structures, favoring an authoritarian and aggressive political culture. Now, China is touching diplomatically onto a vein. This is what is so important to recognize, that the global South still wishes to be in touch with the classical, supposedly pre-modern traditions and resists the nihilistic modernism and postmodernism of the West, the self-identification and absolute personal autonomy. Celebrated just most recently by the German president in a speech to the United Kingdom Parliament, and repeatedly preached by van der Leyen in Brussels on behalf of the European Union and by the United States, obviously, all the time. The theoretical stance of Western modernity is the death of all so-called totalizing visions which provide existential answers to life. This extends not merely to religion, but also to the family, indeed any comprehensive intellect in ethical perspective. Life for the individual is uncertain, and no vision encompassing more than one's own life makes any sense. The radical agnosticism is debilitating, it's making inevitable the loss of hope, except, as Albert Camus has argued, as an entirely solitary individual project. The time in the West, the time of historical and social movements is gone, and while this can promise a harmless lethargy in the West, this, from Dostoevsky, it's better to watch the argument of Dostoevsky that now that God is dead, all is permitted. I'm connecting, and this is very radical to do, but it's following the thought of Xi Jinping. I'm connecting the whole possibility of international order with the nature of the metaphysics that one has underlying one's civilization. And the dialogue of civilizations that Xi Jinping is calling for is basically to grapple with these questions that I'm mentioning as part of the project of building an international order. The commitment is clearest in chapter 3 of the Global Community of Shared Future, where it is stated that harmony is the core concept of Chinese culture. The basic obsession of the West with personal autonomy, of maximizing freedom, is juxtaposed to the maximum that to establish oneself, one must help others to establish themselves. Confucius is quoted, "Do not do unto others what you would not have done to yourself." And this argument is followed with quotations from ancient Greek, ancient Indian, Russian, Swiss, German, Hermann Hesse, Mexican, Arab, Indonesian, and Mongolian wisdom, all in this document, which bears his name, of the Chinese president, all of which express an ontology of the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which holds, I am because we are. And if you want to get an alternative view you can look at Donald Trump's national security document, which insists that basically American security and what American security and prosperity requires is the sole standard by which the United States will judge the legality or the illegality of any policy, which means that any person anywhere in the world that violates a rule of American law is criminalized as a consequence. And whether it is a European company or whether it's a Venezuelan fisherman or boatsman, basically everything is focused on one single country and one single value. And I think what is wonderful about Donald Trump is that he puts his cards on the table and you can see exactly what it is he wants to say. The Chinese nation acts on the belief that humans are part of nature. That's a statement in this document. It's a place of natural law as an organization of international order is restored, and there are direct answers to the injustices that China suffers at present. The requirement that nations should be guided by principles of sincerity and good faith, and when the commitment to the right approach leads directly to a resurrection of the standard of the virtuous and good man, which Van Bankeshek understood as to be the only sound basis for an international order based on treaties. This leads directly, in my view, to the view that it's natural law that requires the restoration of Formosa and the South China Sea islands to China, and not a matter of winning smart aleck technical arguments about international law. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill recognized that they were lost to China through Japanese aggression, which China, the US, and the United Kingdom were jointly attempting to resist. And to renege on this commitment through an illegal refusal on the part of the United States to recognize the PRC as the government of China because it was a communist government, and to prioritize US subjective anxieties about its own security as an explicit justification of its blocking of the restoration of Chinese rights for all actions manifestly in contradiction with this concept of natural law. And I mean, under the rubric of deterring military threats, Donald Trump said that Taiwan must be kept out of Chinese hands because otherwise the United States can't maintain its principle of first line chain of defense to restrain Chinese naval power. I mean, the whole thing is so obviously contrary to any kind of moral common sense. Now, I'll have to skip out if we're not going to keep you here all night. I have to focus in the time available. It's my own fault for writing a paper which is too long. What I would like to bring your attention to mainly is, in conclusion, is a seminar held in Beijing recently. When I was invited to this seminar, I couldn't help smiling, but I learned a little bit more at the seminar than I expected. There was a Brazilian scholar, a Brazilian intellectual, if you like, who wrote a report on Xi Jinping's thought, which I think is relevant to the part that I have had time to discuss today. It's coming up to 6:30. And there's actually two, there are two documents I want to study here. Before I come to this Brazilian writer, I want to mention a remarkable development. I'm living in Beijing and meeting with large numbers of people, and what I'm saying here is basically, I wouldn't have been able to say and wouldn't have said this even 2 or 3 months ago. But I have met at a Catholic church in Beijing, a fellow called Maritz Kuhlmann, who said he was working on Chinese political science theory of the nature of Marxism at the moment. And the study was about the nature of Chinese Marxism. And it is based basically he said what was remarkable, this was work going on within the party and work going on in academia. And his thesis, which has just been accepted in the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, it's called Die Selbstemancipation Chinas Marxistische Philosophy in the Canadian Gegenwart, which means the self-emancipation of China, Marxist philosophy in the Chinese presence. And the whole idea behind this is that all of the thinking of this party since the beginning has been about individual and general emancipation, the idea that you cannot emancipate yourself without emancipating others. And in my view, he doesn't stress sufficiently. It comes out of Marx's text to Judenfrage, to the Jewish question. And in my opinion, it comes back to German idealist doctrine of self-emancipation of Germany from France. So the Chinese Marxism is not a recognizable Marxism that you have understood in the West at all. It's basically a doctrine of self-emancipation and growth to maturity and ability to take upon yourselves the capacity and to have the capacity to direct your own future and your own destiny. Now, the remarkable thing that I want to point out here is that this philosophical foundation there is a philosophical foundation explicitly in the doctrine, the white papers I've talked about, that the development of China has to be in tandem with the development of the global South. That China cannot develop unless it develops with and together with and assists in the development of the global South. And this is basically how China officially understands Marxism, because Marx insisted that the individual person could not be emancipated except in community. We can only emancipate ourselves as we emancipate one another. So this is an ideology which is caught on electrically in the third world and has been picked up in the third world and is the foundation, the ontological foundation for the extraordinary expansion of the concept of the BRICS. And it actually has a philosophical foundation to it, which goes back, in my view, to Fichte. It's terribly important that this is not materialistic at all. This concept of Marxism is predominantly a spiritual concept. And then I was surprised when I had a session with Moritz Kuhlmann that he announced to me that he is in fact a Jesuit priest and he is studying, doing this work in China with the cooperation of the political authorities. And his project is to complete a similar parallel dissertation in Chinese in Renmin University and become a professor of philosophy in Renmin at the same time as he's a professor of philosophy in the Jesuit University in Munich. So what I'm trying to get across here is there is really serious intellectual reflection and thinking going on in China, and it is a foundation for an impetus for such doctrines as the not the Belt and Road, the BRICS. And I have been at numerous conferences in Beijing where I have listened to Argentinians, Mexicans, and others, and South Africans saying, well, we are looking for some kind of guidance, some kind of principle that could provide a foundation for world order, and we're getting it here. We're not getting it from America, and we're not getting it from Europe, but we are getting it in China, and it is catching on electrically, even with countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now even India are catching on to this, not to mention, of course, South Africa. Now, there's a Brazilian interpretation of these developments that was provided by a conference in the Chinese Academy of Social Science History Symposium on the thought of Xi Jinping. It's in Spanish, but fortunately I can read Spanish. And the English title of it is The Contributions of the Thought of Xi Jinping to the Construction of a Collaborative, Prosperous, and Peaceful Multipolar Order. And I'll read that out to conclude. That it'll only take about 5 minutes. The most striking points of the points stressed by De Silva concerns the construction of the subject of international law, which is an essential part of the construction of a law of territory. The neoliberal unipolar world led by the United States hegemon had to be one in which the market is God, reinforced by the postmodern ethos of the consumerist individual, not amenable to any politics of national solidarity. Such subjects are very vulnerable to the outside destabilization by oligarchic elites in the West who actually direct the hegemon, which is America. Latin American states have suffered terribly from this and continue to suffer accordingly from this ideology. De Silva notes that the view of Mearsheimer that this project of neoliberalism has collapsed from within due to the revolt of the disadvantaged within the West, giving rise to the so-called right-wing nationalist movements in Germany, France, Britain, and especially Italy, anti-woke and protectionist. While it is contestable whether these right-wing movements really reject neoliberalism, and that's my view, De Silva stresses that the real challenge to the unipolar world actually comes from the immense scale of the rise of China, offering a quite different model of the state and of development. It is a nationally independent, holistic movement developing harmoniously both material and spiritual dimensions. It offers a comprehensively inclusive world of association of peoples of different civilizations in peaceful dialogue with one another, rather than divisive alliances supposing ideological confrontation. Focusing on China as the only major power offering any world vision, whether north or south, it draws special attention to the peaceful nature of Chinese civilization. Now, I'm entering here on a personal note. De Silva's interpretation would point to China being unable to resort to the use of force to resolve its extremely serious grievances against the US and the Western Pacific, or indeed to use its force to resolve other trouble spots in the world, without shattering contradictions within its own idea of itself, as promulgated in these thoughts of Xi Jinping. However, at the same time, the project of Xi Jinping's thought holds out the prospect of an increasingly harmonious world of equal and independent nation states, leaving the neoliberal version of globalist unilateralism increasingly reduced in geopolitical scope. And the point I want to make there is that when China reiterates endlessly and in very boring fashion its support for the UN Charter and the principles of international law, it really means only one thing: the principle of the sovereign equality and equal dignity of all countries. And the strategy, there is a strategy underlying the pushing of this legal ideology in the third world, which is that, as one young Chinese professor at the so-called Chinese Communist University, when I was telling her, what are you going to do about the American threat? He said, well, we're just going to ignore it. We develop an alternative vision of sovereign equality of states that encompasses the vast majority of the countries in the world, and that will isolate America and Western Europe limit their capacity to influence the global order. So this is a rushed version of my reflections on where we are going with international law and new thinking in China on international order. And I'm very well aware that this is pretty hair-raising and controversial, but it's fun for me to explore. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Tony for giving us the most stimulating lecture, covering a very wide range of issues, from the history of international law to the contemporary world situation and the role of China and the Chinese tradition and the relationship between China and the West and the global South. So there is much food for thought, I think, in this very inspiring lecture, which is also very topical here in Hong Kong, as we in Hong Kong serves as a kind of bridge between China and the West. And there's a lot of interest in Hong Kong about how Hong Kong can facilitate this interaction between China and the global community. So I think we will extend the time for this event by 20 minutes or so. So we welcome questions and the comments from members of the audience here, as well as those who are online. Those who are online can use the there's I think a function for those who are online to type comments and questions, which I can see here. So, is there anyone who would like to raise the first question or comment? And I also see which section should I look at? Is it Q&A? Which section online can people type in there? No, not yet. So maybe I'll ask the first question. You spent some time discussing the circumstances of the conclusion of World War II and the U.S. peace treaty with Japan. So now immediately after World War II, the government of China was still the government of Republic of China, and the government of Republic of China asserted control or took over the island of Taiwan. So, so was there a change in U.S. policy between 1945 when U.S. Was cooperating with the government of Republic of China, and 1949 when the PRC was established?
Well, that is a very difficult question to answer. The legal argument is that Chiang Kai-shek was appointed the military administration of Taiwan, much the same as international law considers that Israel is the military occupant of the West Bank and not the sovereign. And there was an international law procedure for regulating the conclusion of wars, and the absence of this procedure is the legal reason in terms of the history of international law why the whole system has broken down. So that is not recognized in standard textbooks that insist that international law is complete legal order. It is normal practice that a treaty there has to be a peace treaty involving all the powers involved in a conflict to resolve all the questions to do with the conflict. And that has not happened. And it didn't happen because America chose not to recognize the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government. And it did recognize the government of Taiwan. And so I think that there you have the answer to your question. But if one explores, I came across an extraordinary document in the archives of the Eisenhower archives in Princeton, where there is a conversation recorded between George Kennan and General MacArthur, and this was in 1945, saying the western boundary of the United States is the coast of China. And the research, for instance, I've done, in other words, it was always the intention of the United States that it would have military bases in Okinawa, Guam, Japan. And that has nothing much necessarily to do with China. There is So it's very difficult to know whether things would be different if the Chiang Kai-shek had remained in power. There are some statements in the archives to say that we wouldn't object if it was Taiwan that controlled all the South China Sea Islands. There's plenty of statements to say the big concern is the communist regime, and that seems to be what is fundamental about the document I quoted from Fitzmaurice and the outrage in Britain at the refusal of the United States to recognize the communist government of China. So on balance, I would need to do, and one would need to do a great deal more research there. But I think that fundamentally, I think if you put together also the role of Morgenthau in shaping American intellectual culture and its approach to the world, my theory is a kind of pop psychoanalytical theory that after Pearl Harbor, the United States view of the world is a very dangerous place that can really seriously damage the United States. And the only principle for international order is one that guarantees the security of the United States. And this is what is absolutely dominant in Donald Trump's statement. But I would stress that Donald Trump there's nothing new in Donald Trump's strategic position. It's already there, right, going back into the past. I did a study of the Ryukyu Islands, which is now Okinawa, and the Admiral Perry's determination that in the 1850s, Okinawa was a perfect base for the American Navy. And you can see already at this time a determination that the United States should catch up with the British and the French empires in building a solid foundation for its physical presence in Eastern Asia. It's a very messy story.
Thank you. Is there any member of the audience of any? Yeah, yes, please.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm sure you've commented on it in your works elsewhere, but I might not have come across it, so apologies. How does your framework account for China not agreeing with the UNCLOS findings on the South China Sea in 2016? Because you framed the US as instrumentalizing international law against China, but is this not China instrumentalizing it against smaller islands such as the Philippines or ASEAN nations? Just interested in your take. Thank you.
Well, the South China Sea arbitration, I would like to try to express myself moderately here and to avoid any kind of hysterical language. But I would like to quote Carlos Santulli, the director. You won't thank me for quoting this since we're still on air?
Yes.
Carlos Santulli is the Director General of the Graduate Institute for International Law of the University of Paris II and the General Editor of the Revue Générale de Droit International. We had a chat over a glass of wine on this matter, and he said, well, it's a NATO tribunal. What do you expect? I mean, you have a Polish, you have a German, you have a French, you have a Dutch judge, and then you have an African chairperson. What do you expect? In my view, that the research has demonstrated pretty conclusively that, and here I'll try to avoid pejorative language, but an essential part of this judgment is that the South China Sea Islands are not islands for the purpose of the law of the sea convention. And this is in spite of the fact that the French, the Americans, the Japanese, the Australians, and New Zealanders have all been able to agree that infinitely more insignificant land features can generate maritime entitlements over the whole of East Asia. And the so-called tribunal refused to consider any of this evidence, which was already available to it in 2016. to my mind, the judgment is not serious. It's not a professionally serious judgment, and can be therefore easily disregarded. I don't agree with the Chinese position that the court had no jurisdiction to enter the matter at all, because there is a compulsory power of the tribunal to respond to any request of any party to the convention for an interpretation of the meaning of the convention. But this interpretation of Article 121 shows considerable bias. And I understand from my own conversations in China that there is, because I do respect the intelligence of the Chinese government, which is lots of commentators in the West don't seem to be able to do. They do genuinely and sincerely not regard that tribunal or international lawyers generally as serious people. That's their conclusion. And that they tend to, or I would not go so far as to say they have the same view about their own international lawyers, but I have heard them saying that their own international lawyers are not an awful lot of use to them. Because their Chinese international lawyers have totally swallowed the standard Western view about international law being a complete system of law, and spend their time parsing decisions of the international tribunals on quite minor and insignificant questions. And that's how they spend their time, which is not much use to the Chinese government.
Thank you. We have got a question online. The member of the audience online appreciated much Professor Karti's thoughtful lecture. And there's a question. As you have mentioned, treaties are somehow more moral than legal, dating back to the time of World War II. The question is, has the position moved to a framework that is more binding and legal nowadays, since we can witness many national actions which break commitments in the area of WTO dispute resolution or other heated issues currently? So I think, yeah, it's a question of whether treaties should be regarded as more binding and legal these days, and what is China's role in these situations?
Well, this is depending on one's definition of law, and the definition of law of Ancelotti and of the 19th century writers, I consider Westlake and Montague Bernard and so on, is that what you mean by calling a document a legal agreement would mean that there is a legal order in which tribunals can interpret authoritatively the meaning of the document, and these meanings can be then enforced through some kind of executive power. Now that does not exist, and states don't seem to really want it to exist, because there is a very minor rule that provides that you cannot cite a treaty before a court if you have not registered it with the United Nations as a public document. That's part of President Wilson's view and the kind of post-First World War wish to get rid of secret diplomacy. However, secret diplomacy has not disappeared, and the majority of treaties are not disclosed, which indicates that, especially treaties to do with military cooperation. And also these agreements, if you take the NATO agreement, about which there's a great deal of noise, and the Article 5 duty of countries to support a country that's attacked as if they were attacked themselves. These agreements are not legally enforceable, because the manner in which they are drafted still depends upon the discretion of the state as to how much support it will give and how much it will involve itself. So that's what brings one back to what is not a nihilistic argument, but an insistence from Van Bankerstuk, the Dutch international lawyer, at a time when Holland, believe it or not, was the major world power. Until the middle of the 18th century, leading up to the French Revolution, maybe the 7 Years' War that led to the British expulsion of the French from North America or from Canada. The Dutch were the major main world power, and what he's insisting on there, and also I've done research on Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu in France on this. The only fundamental basis for world order is moral integrity and seriousness on the part of the leaders of major countries. And that is basically what Ancelotti is calling for. Ancelotti is not a nihilist, and it's what is being called for by Van Benkescher. And actually, I can look to the new professor of international law in Cambridge, Jan Klavers, who's written a book about the role of virtue in sustaining international order, which is very much the same thing. How can you have an international order if major world leaders are scoundrels? Like Hitler was obviously the most famous example of that, and you have studies of his contempt for treaties. So this is really a study. What one is calling for here, and Morgenthau was also not a nihilist. What one is calling for here is some, in the classical Greek philosophy sense, some prudence on the part of leaders as to what is possible in terms of commitments they enter into, given the circumstances which are very dangerous and changing and unreliable. And Morgenthau gives the example of the aggression of Russia against Finland in 1939. And the British and the French considered themselves under a legal obligation to go to assist Finland against Russian aggression. And they were stopped by Sweden, not allowing British and French troops to cross Sweden into Finland. So that was logistically, it was pretty well impossible to assist Finland. And Morgenthau said, well, if they had succeeded and entered into a war against Russia in 1940, where would that have led for the rest of the Second World War? It would have led to a Russian-German military alliance, Russia joining a military alliance with Germany against Britain and France. Basically, you need, what one is calling for is not a kind of romantic holding to treaties at whatever cost, but a prudent judgment about the extent to which one can honor an obligation. And there are arguments the other way. I mean, Brierley says against Westlake that if you're not going to honor a commitment just because it becomes very onerous, you find that you are up against the odds, like Belgium and France then decide to defend, but France decides to defend Belgium against German aggression. It's taking on a great deal, but that's the nature of the commitment. So the pressure there is very, very great, but it calls for then wise statesmanship, guided by a moral law. So that's would be my answer. But we don't have that at the present time. It's rather obvious. Maybe we have never had it. Noam Chomsky says the moral standards of present world leaders, especially democratic ones, are as awful as the standards of monarchs of the 16th and 17th century.
Thank you. So maybe we'll have the last question and we'll finish then. So the last question, which is online, is what are the major difference between Catholic Christianity and Protestant Christianity when it comes to international law in general and their views on China in particular?
Well, that is obviously another controversial subject. I seem to be attracted to controversy. I think there is the argument, and my friend and colleague, and maybe also rival, Marty Koskaniemi, would take, who is probably an agnostic Lutheran from Helsinki, which has a magnificent Lutheran cathedral, would take the view that modern international law is basically a Protestant science. And it is based on the idea that the only kind of law you can have is the law that, after the reflection on individual conscience, free and autonomous individuals and free and autonomous countries can actually make into an agreement. So law by its nature in the Protestant tradition is positivist. It has to be. Because of the Protestant idea, particularly strong in Lutheranism, that man is blinded by sin. And he is not capable of appreciating a rational order. The Catholic philosophy, going back to the Spanish scholastics, to the late Spanish scholastics, Vittoria, particularly Francisco de Vitoria in the 16th century, is that, and Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages, is that man's reason is sufficiently unclouded for him to be able to see what is objectively required by human nature. And it's that vision which I think is clearly reflected in the writings of Xi Jinping. Without the Chinese committing themselves to any notion of a transcendent deity governing the universe, there may be an immanent rationality in the universe, but there is an absence of a notion of divine law and order or divine intelligence. But the way of thinking is basically that we need to, I think the contribution of Xi Jinping thinking here is to give some substance to the concept of jus cogens in international. Jus cogens in international law as a Protestant science means that there are principles of international law which states do not have the authority to repudiate. But the definition of jus cogens in standard international law is that the rules of international law, which have the character of jus cogens, are the rules which states agree to be rules of jus cogens. In other words, a purely formalist and voluntarist definition. But what one can struggle for within a natural law tradition, and which is very much filled out in these writings that I've been discussing of Xi Jinping, which are basically the philosophy of the Chinese state. I mean, they're in the Chinese constitution now, is that a rational intelligence of a reasonable, sincere, good faith can decipher what is objectively required, and that is what we should be doing.
Thank you. So on that note, I think we will conclude the event this evening. So thank you to all of you, both members of the audience here and those online, for attending this public lecture. And of course, the greatest thanks are due to Professor Anthony Carty. And thank you. And we look forward to your next visit to Hong Kong. So in the meantime, I hope you will make further progress with your research on this particular theme and other related matters.
So thank you very much for the invitation, Albert.
No, thank you. Thank you.